Okay, before we read through the 27 books of the New Testament in 301, I want to just go through a quick little introduction to the New Testament so you can understand exactly what's in there and how the Bible is organized. Now, before we talk about the New Testament, there are two testaments in the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, but both of these testaments are organized according to genre, according to the type of writing. So, for example, in the Old Testament, the first 5 books are Genesis through Deuteronomy, and those are called the Pentateuch, and those are the books of Moses. Moses is said to have written those first 5 books. And then the next books, Joshua on all the way down to Esther, those are the books of history books in the Old Testament. So that's historical writings in the Old Testament. So you'll read about Joshua and his conquests and judges and all the way on through the chronicles of the kings of Israel. And all of this is the story of Israel and Israel's relationship with God. And then the next books in the Old Testament, Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, those are called the poetical books, poetry. And you'll see why as you read those. It's very poetical. That's considered the genre of poetry. And then the final books of the Old Testament, Isaiah all the way down through the end, Malachi, those are all the prophetical books, the books of the prophets. Isaiah was a prophet, and Jeremiah, and on through. And you got major prophets, meaning that the books are longer. And you've got minor prophets, which mean the books are shorter, but those are all the prophetic books. Now notice, the books of the Old Testament are not written chronologically, but they're written according to genre. So that's why it's sometimes confusing to just read it from beginning to end, because you won't necessarily be following the timeline if you do it like that. So just be aware of that. Now, in the New Testament, it's similarly written. So the New Testament is written chronologically, according to genre as well. So you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are called the Gospels, meaning that that's where we learn about Jesus Christ. So there's 4 different authors and 4 different perspectives and stories on Jesus. A lot of those stories are going to be the same because they're telling about the same person. And then the next book is the book of Acts, and that's the story of the early church, how the church began. And then most of the rest of the books are letters. You've got Romans, all the way on down through Philemon. These are called the Pauline epistles, meaning they were written by the Apostle Paul to churches or to individuals. Romans all the way on down through. And then the next section of books, Hebrews, is actually kind of its own kind of a book. But basically, James all the way on down through Jude are called the general letters. Hebrews, at first, Christians believed that Hebrews was also written by Paul, but we don't think Paul was the author. It seems obvious that he wasn't the author. So Hebrews, and then James was written by James, and 1st and 2nd Peter were written by Peter. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were written by John, and then Jude was written by Jude. And those are James through Jude are called the general letters, meaning they're written just to the church in general. Whereas a lot of Paul's letters were written to churches, specific churches, or churches in certain regions, or written to leaders like Timothy or Titus or to his friend Philemon. And then the last book of the New Testament is called Revelation. It's the revelation of John, the disciple, when he was exiled on the island of Patmos. And so that is the revelation is not a letter. It is a revelation that John had. So it's called an apocalyptic writing, where he's writing about the end times. And it's very interesting, but also somewhat confusing book for a lot of new Christians. But this is how the New Testament is organized. So it's organized according to genre. Now, what we've done in our 301 readings is we've split these up so that it's somewhat chronological. So if you look at the readings in 301, you'll see we're going to start with John, which is one of the Gospels. We're going to finish John. Then we're going to read some of Acts. And then we're going to go into one of Paul's letters to the Galatians, because it really relates to Acts 15. And then we're going to do some more of Paul's letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and the Corinthians. And then in week 7, week 8, we're going to finish Corinthians. Then we're going to get into James, which again is a general letter written by James. Then we're going to take a break and read Matthew in weeks 9 and 10. We'll read the Gospel of Matthew. And then we'll finish that in week 11. Then we'll finish Acts in weeks 11 and 12. And then as we go to week 13, we'll get back into Paul's letter to the Romans, in week 14 as well, and then Paul's letter to the Ephesians and Colossians, and then we'll read his letter to Philemon, to Timothy. So some of these are more personal letters now in week 16. Again, a lot of this is because it's somewhat chronological as you read it this way. And then week 17, we'll get into Titus. And then 17 and 18, we'll read the Gospel of Mark, which again is another gospel. So we're spreading the Gospels out in our 24 weeks of reading. And we'll get to Hebrews, and then 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd John. We'll finish with Revelation, and then we'll finish with the Gospel of Luke. And so when you read through all that, it's going to give you a good sense. It'll be a good mixture of reading. It's a pretty good reading plan, a couple of chapters a day, more or less, only on the weekdays. And if you do that, you'll be done in 24 weeks. And I just encourage you to take a note. Each week, we kind of highlight some of the principles from 201, from those lessons in 201. So as you're doing that, we encourage you to read those. Also, when you go online, there's all kinds of commentary, helpful commentary online. If you go to rednotes.org, when you go to read the New Testament, and you'll be able to get into some of the videos, and these are videos to help you, kind of like this intro video before you read that week's worth of readings. It will give you just a good intro to that week for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then if you click on the Read More button, it will bring you not only to that intro video, but it will bring you to some additional commentary that you might find helpful for those readings. So I just encourage you to make a commitment to read through the New Testament, and you'll be so glad you did. And again, don't sweat it if you're confused by some of the things you're reading. If it's your first time reading it, it might take you a few times reading it. So just make the goal, if you've never read the New Testament, to read through it. Watch these videos to help you out as you go along.